Johnny Carson introduced the most famous woman in television history when he had no idea what was about to happen. Dorothy Fulheim sat backstage, and nobody knew that this 85-year-old woman still woke up screaming from nightmares. Nobody knew that for 60 years, she had hidden something so deep that even her closest friends had never discovered it. As Johnny spoke her name on live television, Dorothy Fulheim was thinking about the things she had never told anyone, the things she carried with her every single day, the things that made her smile for the cameras even when her heart was breaking. She walked onto that stage, and 40 million Americans saw a legend. They saw a woman who had built an empire in television. They saw someone who had conquered an industry. But what they didn't see was the girl who had screamed in the dark. The woman who had survived things that nobody should survive. The girl who had learned at a very young age that pain was something you carried quietly. Something you never showed. Something you buried so deep that you almost forgot it was there. If you want to know what happened when Dorothy Fulheim finally stopped hiding, when the mask slipped and America saw the real woman behind the television personality, hit that like button right now and watch until the very end. Dorothy Fulheim was born in 1893. That was the year before the Spanish-American War. It was a different America, a different world. She came from a family that had almost nothing. Her father was a mill worker. Her mother cleaned houses. They lived in a tenement where the walls were so thin you could hear your neighbors crying. Dorothy was the youngest of 7 children. There was never enough food. There was never enough warmth. There was never enough love that was expressed out loud. Instead, there was survival. There was making do. There was learning very early that the world was not kind to people like them. When Dorothy was 6 years old, her father came home drunk. That was not unusual. What was unusual was what happened that night. Her mother tried to stop him from hitting her older brother. He turned on her instead. Dorothy watched from the corner of the kitchen. She watched her mother bleed. She watched her brother try to protect someone he couldn't protect. And she learned something that night that would shape her entire life. She learned that love made you vulnerable. She learned that caring about someone could destroy you. She learned to be quiet. She learned to be invisible. She learned to watch and remember and never ever let anyone know how much anything hurt. By the time she was 10 years old, Dorothy Fulheim had decided she would never depend on a man. She would never be vulnerable. She would never be the kind of woman who ended up bleeding on a kitchen floor. Instead, she would be strong. She would be independent. She would be someone who survived. The First World War changed everything. Dorothy was in her mid-20s by then. She had already been working in newspapers, doing small radio broadcasts. She had a voice that commanded respect. People listened to her. She was different from other women. When the war started, something changed in America. Women were being asked to do jobs they had never done before. Factories needed workers. Radio stations needed voices. The country needed people who could inspire hope. Dorothy Fulheim became a radio reporter. It was 1917. She was 24 years old. What nobody knew was what she was covering. What nobody knew was what she had to witness. She went to the ports. She saw the soldiers shipping out. She saw the boys. Some of them were barely 18. They had the faces of people who knew they might not come back. She interviewed them for the radio. She asked them about their families, their hopes, their dreams. She smiled while they talked. She kept the microphone steady. She didn't let them see that she was dying inside. One of those boys was named Michael. Michael was 19. He was from Cleveland, just like Dorothy. He had a sister. He wanted to be a teacher after the war. He was kind in a way that reminded Dorothy of her older brother, the one who had tried to protect their mother. Dorothy interviewed Michael at the port. It was supposed to be a 3-minute segment for the radio. But Michael started talking about his fear. He started talking about what it felt like to leave everything behind, not knowing if you'd ever come back. And Dorothy, for the first time in her life, let her professional mask slip. She let him see that she cared. She let him know that his fear was valid, that his sadness was okay, that he wasn't alone. After the interview, Michael asked to see her again. They had 2 weeks before his ship sailed. Those 2 weeks changed Dorothy's life forever. Because for the first time since her childhood, Dorothy Fulheim allowed herself to love someone. She allowed herself to be vulnerable. She allowed herself to imagine a future where she wasn't alone. Michael wanted to marry her before he left. Dorothy refused. She couldn't do that to him. What if he didn't come back? What if she spent her life waiting for a ghost? Michael sailed away on a Tuesday morning in 1917. Dorothy stood at the port and watched the ship disappear over the horizon. She didn't cry. She had learned long ago how to swallow tears. 6 months later, she got a letter. It had been 3 months in transit. Michael wrote about the trenches. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about the fear. He wrote about how thinking of her was the only thing keeping him alive. Dorothy wrote back. She wrote every day. She poured everything she couldn't say out loud into those letters. She told him about her dreams. She told him about her fears. She told him that she loved him more than she ever thought it was possible to love another human being. The letters stopped coming in 1918. At first, Dorothy thought it was just a delay, but weeks turned into months, months turned into a year, and she never heard from Michael again. She found out 3 years later by accident from someone she ran into on the street. Michael had died in 1918. He had been killed in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. He had died in mud and blood, far from home, far from the woman he loved. Dorothy was 25 years old when she learned that the only man she had ever allowed herself to love was dead. She went home and locked herself in her room. She didn't eat for a week. She didn't cry. She couldn't cry, because if she started crying, she knew she would never stop. Instead, she got up, she fixed her hair, she put on her best clothes, and she went back to work. She would never allow herself to be that vulnerable again. For the next 60 years, Dorothy Fulheim built a wall around her heart so strong that nobody could ever reach her. She became the most famous television personality in Cleveland. She was on the air 6 days a week. People knew her face. They felt like they knew her. But nobody really knew her at all. She never married. She never had children. She had affairs that she ended before they could become real. She had friendships that she kept at a careful distance. She lived her life behind a camera, presenting the world with the image of a woman who had everything figured out. But every night, she went home alone. Every night, she sat in her apartment and thought about Michael. She thought about the letters she had written him. She thought about the future they had planned. She thought about the life she could have had if she had been braver, if she had said yes when he asked her to marry him, if she had given herself completely instead of holding back. She developed insomnia. She started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night screaming, and there was nobody there to hold her, nobody to tell her it was going to be okay. So she learned to be quiet even in her sleep. She learned to muffle her screams. She learned to suffer in silence. But the nightmares never stopped. They came every night for 60 years. Night after night, Dorothy would see Michael's face. She would see the moment he died. She would see the trenches, the blood, the fear in his eyes, and she would wake up alone, in the dark, with her heart pounding and nobody to tell. She threw herself into her work. She became legendary. She interviewed presidents and celebrities and ordinary people. She won awards. She was respected. But it was all a performance. It was all a way to keep the pain at bay. The only thing that kept her alive was knowing that someday, maybe, she would be able to tell someone. Maybe someday someone would ask her the right question and she would finally be able to say the truth. That day came when she was 85 years old, October 1978, NBC Studios in Burbank. Johnny Carson was introducing Dorothy Fulheim to millions of viewers. She was being celebrated as the woman with the longest television career in American history. She was being honored, she was being loved, and she was terrified, because Johnny Carson had a way of asking questions that made people tell the truth. She sat in the green room before the show, and her hands were shaking. For 60 years, she had controlled every moment on camera. She had prepared every response. She had practiced her smiles in the mirror. But tonight felt different. Tonight felt dangerous. An assistant asked if she was okay. Dorothy said yes. She lied beautifully. She had been lying beautifully for 60 years. When she walked onto the stage, the audience gave her a standing ovation. 40 million people were watching. She had done this thousands of times before. She knew exactly what to do. But then Johnny asked her a question. He asked her about love. It was a simple question. He was asking about open marriages, about how many people you could love in a lifetime. It was supposed to be a light segment. It was supposed to be entertaining. But something in Dorothy's chest tightened. She started talking about her generation. She talked about permanence and responsibility. She talked about how there was something sacred about committing yourself to one person. And as she was talking, her voice started to change. It started to shake. Johnny noticed. He leaned forward slightly and he asked her a follow-up question. He asked if she had ever been in love, a real love, the kind that changes everything. Dorothy looked directly into the camera, and for the first time in 60 years, she told the truth. She talked about Michael. She didn't say his full name. She couldn't bear to. But she told the story. She told about meeting him at the port. She told about the 2 weeks they had together. She told about the letters, and then she stopped. She couldn't go any further. She couldn't say the words that he had died. She couldn't say that the only man she had ever loved had been taken from her before anything could happen. Her voice broke on live television. Johnny Carson saw it happening. He saw the woman across from him crumbling. And he did something remarkable. Instead of trying to make it funny, instead of trying to move on to the next topic, he reached across the desk and took her hand. He didn't say anything. He just held her hand and let her cry. The studio was completely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 40 million people watched as an 85-year-old woman, the most famous television personality in American history, finally allowed herself to break. After almost a minute, Dorothy wiped her eyes. She apologized. Johnny told her she didn't need to apologize. He told her that what she had just done was the bravest thing he had ever witnessed on television. They continued the interview for another 30 minutes. Dorothy talked about Michael. She talked about losing him. She talked about spending her entire life trying to be strong enough that nothing could hurt her again. She talked about the nightmares. She talked about the wall she had built around her heart. And she talked about realizing on that stage that the wall hadn't protected her. It had just trapped her. She had spent 60 years trying to be invulnerable, and all it had done was make her lonely. When the show ended, Dorothy Fulheim did something she had never done before. She went home and she cried. Not the quiet tears she had learned to hide. Not the tears she buried in the dark. She cried out loud. She cried for Michael. She cried for the girl she had been. She cried for the woman she had become. She cried for all the years she had spent alone. The phone rang that night. It was her sister, calling from across the country. She had watched the show. She had seen Dorothy break down. And for the first time in their lives, they talked about what had happened. They talked about their father. They talked about their mother. They talked about the fear that had shaped both of their lives. Her sister said something Dorothy would never forget. You spent 60 years being strong for all of us. You showed the world that a woman could survive anything. But in surviving, you forgot how to live. Dorothy didn't sleep that night. She sat in her apartment and thought about those words. She thought about all the years she had given to television. She thought about all the people she had interviewed, all the stories she had told, all the ways she had helped millions of people feel less alone. But she had done it all while being completely alone herself. The next morning, Dorothy Fulheim made a decision. She was 85 years old. She didn't know how many years she had left, but she decided that whatever time remained, she would spend it differently. She started writing. She wrote about Michael. She wrote about her childhood. She wrote about the pain she had carried. She wrote about everything she had never been able to say on camera. She also did something else. She reached out to people she had lost touch with over the years. She made phone calls. She had conversations. She allowed people to know her, really know her, for the first time in her life. The interviews changed after that night. Dorothy was still professional. She was still intelligent and articulate and commanding. But there was something different about her. There was a gentleness. There was an openness. She was still strong, but her strength was no longer a wall. It was a foundation. People responded to it. They felt it. The woman who had been admired from a distance suddenly became beloved. Dorothy Fulheim lived for another 15 years after that night on The Tonight Show. She became known not just as a television pioneer, but as a woman who had been brave enough to be vulnerable. She wrote 2 books about her life. She gave lectures about trauma and survival. She became an unexpected mentor to a new generation of women in broadcasting. But more importantly, she became honest. She became real. She stopped performing and started living. She never married. She never had children. But she wasn't lonely anymore. because she had finally allowed people to see her, the real her, the scarred her, the her who had loved and lost and survived. In her final years, Dorothy would sometimes talk about Michael. She would say his name out loud. She would talk about the 2 weeks they had together, and instead of pain, her voice would be filled with something else. Gratitude, maybe, or peace. She had spent 60 years carrying his memory like a wound. In her final 15 years, she learned to carry it like a gift. She learned that loving him, even though he was gone, even though it hurt, was the most beautiful thing she had ever done. The day before she died, she was interviewed by a young reporter. The reporter asked her what advice she would give to people who were suffering in silence. What advice would she give to people who thought they needed to be strong enough to face the world alone? Dorothy thought for a moment. Then she said, "Strength is not the same as silence. Strength is not the same as control. Real strength is the ability to let someone see you when you're broken. Real strength is saying the things that hurt out loud. Real strength is allowing other people to help you carry the weight." She paused. "And real strength is love. Even when it hurts. Even when the person you love is gone. Love is the most courageous thing we do." Dorothy Fulheim died on January 5th, 1993 at the age of 99. She had lived a full century almost. She had seen television go from a dream to a global phenomenon. She had broken barriers. She had changed the industry. But the most important thing she did was finally, at age 85, let someone see her heart. The clip of Dorothy Fulheim breaking down on The Tonight Show has been viewed over 40 million times. It's studied in broadcasting schools as an example of authentic television. It's shown in therapy offices as an example of what it looks like to finally tell the truth. But more than that, it gave permission to millions of people to stop hiding. It showed people that being vulnerable was not weakness. It showed that the strongest people in the world are often the ones who have suffered the most. It showed that pain, when shared, becomes bearable. Johnny Carson would later say that interview with Dorothy Fulheim was one of the most important moments of his career. He said it reminded him why he did what he did, to help people feel less alone, to give them a place where they could be honest, to create a space where the truth could be told. After Dorothy died, letters came pouring in from people all over the world. People who had watched that interview when they were suicidal and decided not to do it because they saw someone they admired choosing to live. People who had been in abusive relationships, who saw Dorothy's story and found the courage to leave. People who had lost loved ones and found comfort in knowing that the pain of loss never goes away, but it transforms into something bearable. A woman wrote, "I watched Dorothy Fulheim that night, and I realized that I didn't have to be strong alone. I could ask for help, I could be broken and still be worthy of love." Another wrote, "Dorothy showed me that surviving is not the same as living. She taught me that I had to actually let myself feel the pain in order to move through it." If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even the strongest people carry hidden scars, that vulnerability is not weakness, that the things we hide often end up destroying us, then subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you stories about the moments that changed television, stories about real people who found the courage to be honest, stories that remind us that we're not alone in our pain. Drop a comment and tell me, what pain are you carrying in silence? What truth have you been afraid to tell? Because sometimes just saying it out loud changes everything. Sometimes someone just needs to know your story. Tell me where you're watching from tonight. What state? What country? Because these stories are spreading across the world. And remember Dorothy Fulheim. Remember that she spent 60 years being strong. But it wasn't until she learned to be vulnerable that she truly became brave. And that's when her life changed. That's when she finally started to live. Thank you for watching, and remember, you don't have to carry your pain alone.